You're listening to Eating for Eden, Episode 11. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. We know that consuming plant sources of protein is better for planetary health. This is because animal sources of protein, beef in particular, but others as well, have a much higher carbon footprint than plant sources. But it's worth asking, are we making sacrifices to our physical health by making food choices with the planet in mind? Might it be possible that we're prioritizing planetary health over bodily health? As vital as it is to make food choices with the environment in mind, it's also important to consider whether those choices are best for our individual bodily health, both in the short and long term. A question that often arises in the world of fitness and nutrition is whether one of these protein sources, animal or plant, is, quote, superior. Is animal protein superior to plant protein? Is plant protein superior? Or are they more or less equivalent? That's what this episode is going to explore. I want you to know how your food choices are affecting both environmental health and your own health. As we dive in, a more fundamental question to begin with is this: what does it mean for one source of protein to be superior to the other? Often this question arises in circles where building muscle is of primary importance. For example, one might ask which protein source is superior for building muscle. While building and maintaining lean muscle is crucial for all of us to remain healthy and strong, in other words, we don't have to be bodybuilders to care about eating for healthy musculature, that is not the only measure of protein's effectiveness or potential superiority. But before moving on to consider other factors related to a protein source's effectiveness and potential superiority, I want to start by addressing this question of whether animal or plant protein is superior to the other for healthy muscle and strength. Researcher Hamilton Rochelle from the University of Sao Paulo and his team wanted to test this very thing. They worked with two groups of young men. One group was vegan and the other omnivore. And they worked for them for 12 weeks, matching both their amount of protein intake on a gram per kilogram of body weight basis, and led them through a supervised training program. This study is super fascinating as it helps to break down initial assumptions we may have about protein and exercise-based muscle gains. Many people tend to assume that animal protein is superior to plant protein when it comes to building muscle. However, this study found that plant protein was just as effective. They concluded that, and I quote, a high protein, that is approximately 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight a day, a high protein, exclusively plant-based diet, plant-based foods plus soy protein isolate supplementation, is not different than a protein-matched mixed diet, mixed whole foods and whey protein supplementation, in supporting muscle strength and mass accrual, suggesting that protein source does not affect resistance training-induced adaptations in untrained young men consuming adequate amounts of protein. This study found that neither animal nor plant protein was superior to the other for building muscle and strength. As long as adequate amounts of protein were consumed in subjects engaged in enough resistance training exercise, protein source didn't make a significant difference. This is a huge win for plant protein. Even though it was not shown to be superior in this case, the fact that it performs just as well as animal protein provides reassurance to those considering making plant-based swaps. In short, those looking to build muscle and strength on a predominantly or exclusively plant-based diet have nothing to fear. Also, with regard to the study, since I don't advocate relying on a quick look at a study's abstract or conclusion for making significant lifestyle changes, don't just take my word for it. I encourage you to listen to Simon Hill's interview with Hamilton Rochelle in episode 137 of the Proof podcast, linked in the show notes. They get into the details of the study, such as what the researchers were looking to measure, how they conducted the study, how they interpreted the findings, and much more. So plant protein doesn't fall short when it comes to building muscle. This is terrific news. But what about other health considerations? How do animal and plant sources of protein stack up head-to-head, considering other potential outcomes such as longevity and risk for developing chronic disease? Again, it is important to consider these questions alongside questions of environmental health. We want to understand which source of protein is best for human health overall, and whether it might conflict with which is best for the planet overall. A recent study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition showed new findings from a cohort that has been followed for 30 years. Known as the Prospective Nurses Health Study Cohort, this is one of the largest epidemiological studies conducted to date and has been a terrific source of nutritional insight over the years. If you're not super familiar with this sort of science, epidemiology is important and valuable for science as it provides the opportunity to observe patterns of behavior and outcomes regarding situations that would be impossible or unethical to study in a randomized control trial. As one example, we can't randomize groups of people to smoke or not to smoke for 10 plus years. As another example, there are so many nutritional variables that one might want to test. Epidemiology gives the opportunity of zeroing in on various specific patterns across large groups of people over time. This study looks at how protein consumption in midlife affects healthy aging. It considered overall protein intake, as well as the effects of animal protein, dairy protein, and plant protein specifically. And I will just note here briefly that some recent responses to this study on social media are an example of what Chris McCaskill and I discussed back in episode 9. We have to be careful what we're consuming and how we're weighing the evidence. I commend to you a recent episode of The Proof, where Simon Hill unpacks this study, showing where some interpretations have gone off the rails a bit. I appreciate both Simon's cordiality and his clarity. I hope you will too. Okay, back to the study. While protein intake in general was associated with higher odds of healthy aging, plant protein had the best outcomes of all sources, pulling away from both animal and dairy, as well as total protein. The study notes that plant protein was also associated with higher odds of absence of physical function limitations and good mental status. In substitution analyses, they also observed that substituting plant protein for dairy or animal protein, as well as some other sources of food, resulted in significant positive associations. Check out the show notes to go deeper on this study. Getting back to our question of whether one source of protein is superior to the other, this study provides evidence for preferring plant protein to animal protein when it comes to adopting long-term dietary patterns to avoid chronic disease and maintain both healthy physical and cognitive function. This study's outcomes suggest that plant protein is indeed superior to animal protein for the sake of one's health span and longevity. While it's lovely to find that plant protein is on par with animal protein for building muscle and strength, it's even better to discover that it's likely to promote better long-term health as well. Add to that the fact that consuming plant protein is better for planetary health, and I think we have an answer for the question of which is superior overall. While animal and plant protein are essentially neck and neck when it comes to muscle and strength, plant protein pulls ahead, showing better promise for long-term health and clearly has a much lower carbon footprint than animal protein. It's empowering to discover that choosing to emphasize plant sources of protein in our diets can be a powerful win-win solution. While lowering our own carbon footprints by favoring plant protein and helping businesses do the same by voting with our dollars, we can also foster our own health and longevity, not to mention not having to worry about any losses in the gym. Before we wrap up, I realize I've been pretty general with terms so far, using words like animal protein and plant protein. Some might be wondering, is she just talking about protein powder, supplements? Using such terms could make it sound like I'm only talking about isolate powders like whey compared to pea protein, while protein powders certainly factor into this conversation. For example, the first study I mentioned on muscle building and strength used protein powder for both groups to reach their desired intake during the study, it does go beyond that to whole and minimally processed foods. So when I say words like animal protein, this means various kinds of meat and dairy products, so beef, pork, chicken, cow's milk and yogurt, cheese, etc. On the flip side, when I say words like plant protein, this could include numerous foods from high protein sources like tofu, tempeh, and all manner of legumes, as well as other plant sources such as nuts, seeds, and whole grains, which have a decent amount of protein as well. Whole foods and protein powders both factor into this conversation. I am so glad that you joined me to listen in today, and it's a pleasure to get to share with you what I'm learning to help equip you to make healthful choices, both for Eden and for yourself. If you have questions or topics you'd like to hear addressed here on Eating for Eden, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to edenandme@substack.com. Also, if you've been enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a review. It's a great help for getting these important words out to others. I hope that this conversation leads you to explore more of these studies' findings and also gets you curious to try out more plant-based swaps in your own day-to-day eating. And I hope that you feel encouraged to start where you are, do what you can, and build from there. Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.